Hello, welcome to the PitchBook Podcast. This is our fourth episode. We're excited to have you here. Zach, welcome. How are you?
Good, Matt. How are
Good,
you?
good.
How was Green Bay? How was
It was
Cheesehead
he said
land?
it was really fun. It was a great game to go to if you're a Detroit fan, because Detroit just boat raced Green Bay, and it was hilarious because you're in the deepest part of enemy territory, and there was tons of lion blue. You could hear, if you pay attention to the broadcast toward the end, you can hear them chanting "Let's go Lions." It was fantastic, and going to Green Bay was really cool because it's such a small town, and it's one of the unique places in football that has a small town team has kept the team in the city. It's a couple hours drive from Milwaukee, so it's not exactly very easy to get to, and it's kind of cool because we parked on some guy's lawn, like that was just down the block from the stadium. So just imagine the suburbs, and then all of a sudden there's this giant stadium in the middle of the suburbs. So it was a really cool, interesting place. My wife loved it. She went crazy watching the Lions win. So it was a lot of fun.
And they won
They did.
34-20.
The 20.
They're
Yep.
3-1, and Packers are 2-2.
Yeah. So it was interesting. There were quite a few Lions fans around that Cammy was enjoying the game with. So a lot of fun.
We went. This was a couple months ago. We went to a Giants game to San Francisco, and just what you hear from being in San Francisco, you're not sure what the city's going to be like. So I wonder maybe if it was better going to Green Bay, watching them play Detroit, or what's downtown Detroit look like?
So, well, back up one second. You went to a baseball game, Giants, right? Who did they
Yeah,
play? Was it
they
Oakland or no?
they played Oakland.
Okay, so did you go in wearing enemy colors? Because I know you're an A's fan.
Oh man, I was so conflicted. I had on it. I will confess, I wore a giant scarf
Okay,
because I just wasn't sure
you didn't want
how.
to. Yeah,
I didn't want people to be too aggressive.
I hear you. I went to a Raiders game, and I'm a Ravens fan, but I went to a Raiders game, the very first game I NFL game I'd ever been to, and the Raiders are kind of notorious. That Bay Area is pretty rough, and I'm like, I bought a Raiders shirt because I'm like, and they were playing the Cowboys. I don't like the Cowboys either, but I was like, I'm just gonna pretend to be a Raiders fan today, because you just never know what's gonna happen, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah. And you don't even want to be neutral because that could
that
cause
that could be,
problems. So we
yeah. So
got.
anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say we were driving. We got off the freeway, dropped down into the city for a few blocks, and San Francisco was looking rough. I'm like, I am not stopping the car. Jumped back on a little freeway, and then it took us over closer to the stadium. Where we parked was in a business complex, like Uber's headquarters were there. It was so nice. It was like two different cities
Oh
almost.
yeah, for
But I
sure.
was just thinking, like, what does Detroit look like? But you guys were in Green Bay, so
So we have been to Detroit, and it's surprisingly better than it used to be. I went to a Tigers game. I was in Detroit for work many years ago, and we went to a Tigers game, and we went some people that supposedly knew the area, knew a shortcut, and I don't know if you want to take a shortcut through Detroit like that. At least 15, 20 years ago when I went. I think we saw some people, selling things that most, would consider not quite legal. It was interesting, and so I was always nervous to take Cami to Detroit. So when we did go, we stayed over by the airport. We just Ubered in, Ubered out, and it was interesting because we talked to the Uber driver on the way back or on the way to the game, and he said that they've invested a lot of money into the city now, and it's definitely changed from when I was there. It was a lot better. And then a couple years later, we went back and stayed downtown and right by the stadium, and it was definitely a lot better. So I think Detroit gets a bad rap, and it's definitely gotten better in my opinion. So
yeah, that's awesome.
there you go.
Well, we're
Anyway,
we're trying to hit every ballpark before we die. So
nice. How many have you done?
I think we've done 6.
Okay.
There's parks that she's been to that I haven't been to, and there's parks I've been to she hasn't been to. So every year we just try to tick tick one off. And this year,
So does it count for you? So you only count the ones you've been to together. Is that
yes,
okay?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. We've got to go to the game. We have to get a ball, and this year we took our kids with us. So it was Giants, A's. A's, of course, are my
Yeah.
team, but everybody there that was wearing A's gear, one of the jerseys that I saw in one of the fans, it said "sell the team" on the back instead of a last name of a player.
Yes.
It said "sell the team." So there's definitely some rift going on with the A's fans in Oakland, but it was fun. And if the A's lost, but it was
Now they're this is interleague play, right? They're not
yeah,
the same. Okay. Yeah, National League and Interleague. Okay.
That's right. But they do kind of the Battle of the Bay.
What's your favorite stadium? Favorite stadium you've been to then?
The Dodger Stadium. I thought it was pretty cool.
Okay.
Have you been there?
I haven't been to Dodgers. I've been to like Angels, Giants, Oakland, um, Arizona. I've been to the Rangers, Texas Rangers. I think that's it for me. But
Yeah,
anyway.
the Rockies. They're all fun.
Rockies. I've been to the Rockies. Yeah.
Yeah, I did a tour to the Boston Red Sox Fenway. I mean, that was awesome. It's a really small park. I mean, it's very intimate. I didn't watch them play, but we did a corporate thing years ago, and we just kind of got to eat and walk around. It was kind of fun to see all of the memorabilia.
So it doesn't count then.
We
right?
have to go together, so we both get to experience. So maybe Fenway, but she's been to Wrigley. I have not been to Wrigley, so we have to go.
Okay.
We have to go again. Anyways,
very cool. All right, well, keep us updated.
All right. Okay. Well, let's hear what you've got for us this week. What book?
All right, this week
are you pitching.
Let me tell you first of all how I saw and got this book. I was watching a show on Apple Plus or whatever it's called. Everything's called Plus now, but I was watching a show. There's this guy in the military. It's called Invasion. If anyone's seen it or whatever, it's okay. I'm not quite through the first part of the first season, but about this alien invasion. There's a guy. I think he's in. I don't know. I think he's in somewhere in the Middle East. Anyways, a military guy. Everything disappears because the aliens attack, and he looks at his buddies. He's looking at his buddy's cot, and he picks up this book. And this book that he picks up, I'm like, that looks interesting. I'm gonna have to check that book out. So the name of the book is Prisoners of Geography. Something. Okay, so this guy in this fictional show is reading this book. I'm like, okay, is this a real book? First of all, and here's the nerdy part. I really like maps. I like geography. I like to travel, but I've always liked just weirdly to look at maps. I find them interesting. Globes, I think they're cool. Again, this is a bit nerdy, so I'm like, oh, Prisoners of Geography. That sounds really interesting to me. And so I looked it up, and it's a real book, and it is a guy. The author's name is Tim Marshall, and apparently he is a reporter, like a political reporter. Now, I'm not into politics. I don't like politics at all, actually. But this book is about how geography has shaped geopolitics. And it's basically the subtitle is 10 maps. So it's Prisoners of Geography, 10 maps that explain everything about the world. I'm like, okay, that sounds actually pretty cool. So I checked it out. I listened to this book, and it's not very long. And it was interesting. And I'll tell you a little bit about what it talks about. But I will say, if you're not into geography, or you're not into like politics, and again, I'm not into politics, so I liked the book for the geography stuff and how it relates to politics, but I don't care about the politics, if that makes any sense. So I'll just tell you right now, this book, as far as I'm concerned, is probably like a double. But if you're really into both politics and geography, this might be like a triple or home run for you. Okay.
So is this like of the U.S. or just the?
So this is 10 maps of the whole world. So it's
okay.
Let me just tell you what the maps are. There's Russia, China, United States, Western Europe, Africa, the Middle East, India and Pakistan, Korea and Japan. Those are India and Pakistan are together. Korea and Japan are together. Latin America, the Arctic, oceans, and outer space. So he goes through in depth on all 10 of these maps that he talks about how the geography has shaped history, shaped geopolitics, shaping future political positions, and things like that. So it was really interesting to me. I've always had an interest in Russia. I think I grew up in the Cold War, where you have to hide under your desk, right? Because the Russians were going to attack. And so I've always kind of been interested in the Cold War. So anything about Russia is interesting to me. We'll get into some books that I've read about that later. But so he's specifically talking about the first one. We'll just go into detail a little bit on this one. He goes into Russia, and he talks about how Russia's expansive territory and size gives it some natural barriers, basically, to made it susceptible to invasions, both the West, so think of, but over in Europe, and from the East. And it's basically geographically vulnerable. And that's kind of influenced Russia's imperial ambitions, their concerns. One thing that was super interesting to me is the reason, and let me just tell you this book was completed in 2015. So he actually talks about an invasion into Ukraine prior to this. And he talks about one of the main reasons is so they had a warm water port to the Black Sea, because the other ports that are up in the north in the Arctic are frozen 3 to 4 months of the year. So one of the reasons that Russia is so interested in the Ukraine and lower in Crimea and all that stuff is because it's warm water port. And so he talks a lot about how, you have, if you're bordering the sea, you have to have a navy, because it's one giant plateau, basically, that whole continent. That's why it's susceptible to attacks from both the West and the East. And it just talked about also the natural resources and some of the things that Russia's interests have always been in protecting itself and really furthered its expansion, because its territory was so easy to attack. So anyway, he goes a lot into that. That's the very first one. He talks about Russia. Next, he talks about China and some of the natural borders with Mongolia and things like that. And the reason they built the Great Wall, and how they've recently started to develop a navy, and just basically how they do have big rivers that allow them to travel easily, in the older times.
Yeah.
And basically it's China's trying to expand its territory because of its population size, and how how do they have enough agriculture to sustain themselves, things like that, right? That's kind of what they talk about. The United States was really interesting because he talks about how the two oceans are natural borders or natural defenses, because there's the only way you could attack is from Canada or Mexico. And if you did, you'd have to have a long supply chain, supply runs. He talks a lot about that with Russia, how, Napoleon, one of the biggest issues for him getting to Russia was supply line. And anyway, so basically how the US, partially because of when it was quote unquote discovered, and because of its geography, it's been very protected from invasion naturally, because us having Florida was a big deal, because it gatekeeps the Caribbean, things like that. It talks about basically territorial expansion by Louisiana Purchase was really critical. Us buying Alaska, things like that are critical to kind of the US's defense and what made it. I mean, and then he talks a lot about us getting different air bases from the British over time, and how important it is, like Hawaii, the location of Hawaii. So anyway, he talks about that. One thing that was really interesting, let me just dovetail that into Western Europe. He talks about, how Western Europe, everyone has a sense of what country they're from. And so because they've been around for so long, and he talks about they basically have complex and ever-changing borders, and basically geography has just been instrumental in shaping that region, and the conflicts, and how the rivers interconnect between countries.
Yes.
One thing that he said was super interesting, though, is because the United States growth was so rapid, nobody really considers them. Everyone in America considers themselves an American first and a Texan second. They don't consider them, maybe Texas is the wrong answer. Maybe they do consider them a Texan first, but they basically said that the states had only been around such a short period of time, and the U.S. became a large power so quickly that nobody considers themselves a Virginian first. Whereas if you're in the European Union, quote unquote, you still are French, right? You're still from France or from Spain or whatever, Spanish. So that was really interesting when you kind of comparison contrast the U.S. geography and history versus Western Europe. Africa was super interesting. One of the things that most people don't realize when you just look at a map is truly how big. This is how he starts off Africa, is how big Africa actually is. It looks like it's the same size as Greenland when you look at a flat map, but that's just because the maps can't, when they're flat, they can't quite do it justice. He talks about how Africa, part of the issues is some of their geography that's challenging is the jungles that have diseases and insects and things like that. So the geography shapes how the terrain basically shapes how they have to interact. And also talks about the European influence and then drawing borders without any real knowledge of the area. And so people have fought over, this tribe's been in power for so long, and suddenly the DRC's borders don't make any sense to the local people. And anyway, so he talks a lot about that. He talks about, kind of how the two main rivers are critical, like the Nile, and how there's arguing, I think it's over Ethiopia and Egypt, over who controls water. So things like that.
Yeah.
He's talking about that. Middle East, I don't even want to get into. That one's crazy. You can listen to the book if you want to read it. India and Pakistan were really interesting because there's a natural border, I believe, of that basically there's been two tensions in how basically geography plays a role in their rivalry. And there's a really strategic importance of the city of Kashmir, why that is. Anyway, just kind of interesting. Korea and Japan are super interesting. Korea is that peninsula was so important to us because of we didn't want communism to continue to go on. He talks a lot about North Korea, which is super interesting. Japan, basically how they're just an island nation, even though they expanded. They basically have to have a very, very strong navy because of how they're built, things like that. And then Latin America, it talks about basically how it's just because of geography, it's always going to be a coastal continent because it's so much of it's just almost uninhabitable in the jungles or mountains. And so it also talks about like just how important some of the ports are. I think it was a port in Argentina. One port in Argentina can do like all the traffic of like all 5 of the biggest ports in Brazil because of the deep sea ports, just the way they're set up or something. So it's just kind of interesting because all of this stuff influences trade, geopolitics. Yes. Again, I don't care too much about the politics, but it is interesting to hear his take on why certain people will care about things that you wouldn't know they'd care about. Like, why in the world did the US, why does China care about who claims these random uninhabited islands by Japan? And it's just because of sea lanes and sea traffic and things like that you wouldn't know. And then at the very end, he kind of wraps up. It's actually pretty short on the last one. He talks about the Arctic oceans, and then obviously like the future of outer space. Who's going to claim what parts of outer space? Apparently, there's still 5 American flags on the moon right now. The Russians have put a waterproof, rust-proof Russian flag on the seafloor underneath the Arctic to claim the Arctic for themselves.
I did not know that.
So yeah, it's just kind of interesting. And again, I'm not super into politics, but the geography stuff was really interesting to me, and it puts a lot of things into perspective, and probably a lot of things that you wouldn't realize if you're just kind of studying politics in general. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it reminds me of a book that I'm listening to right now called Guns, Germs, and Steel. Have you read that book?
No, but it sounds interesting. I'm already interested. Yeah.
Okay.
Sounds cool.
Very similar, where you have peoples that, like in Hawaii or the islands, that didn't have access to different metals. So they had access to rocks, and they just worked within what they had.
Right.
And so their community evolved that way, their currency evolved that way. And you've got these little populations all over the world that are evolving certain ways based on the materials they have, the resources they have, the temperature. He goes into like hunter versus gatherer. So does he go back in time, or where does it start?
He goes back and forward. It depends on the location, right?
Okay.
So for the US, he doesn't really start with like, the native inhabitants, right? Because that's not relevant to the geopolitical stuff that's going on right now. Other than the fact that, you know, the colonial people came in and kind of conquered, and they conquered relatively quickly. If that makes any sense. In as far as historically speaking, but like for China, he'll go back to I'm making this up, but you know, 1600 BC, because that's when the, you know, this tale of, actually I think maybe that was North Korea, where the tale of like the divine leader, so their, you know, their communist leader has been given divine, you know, supremacy over that nation or something, you know, whatever it is. So it really depends. I think the one thing I should mention too is he does talk about the future, not only with space exploration and things like that in Arctic, which in theory we could still battle over. He does talk about how technology is changing the geographical factors, right? So he talks about how drones make it easier to do things, satellite makes it easier to do things, to overcome some of these historically difficult geographical conditions. So anyway, he goes past and then potential future, things like that. And he, you know, he talks about how like some people are worried that, you know, the issues between North Korea and Japan might be a problem, but maybe here's one reason why it wouldn't be, because China North Korea is important to China, and the China shipping lanes are important to, you know, to Japan. I'm making all that up because I don't really remember, but that's the gist, is that he talks about some of the future potential problems and things that we need to keep our eyes peeled on, or at least the politicians need to. So anyway, yeah, he does talk about future, past, and kind of present, and again, it's really interesting. I'm giving it a double, which is maybe a little bit harsh. I did really enjoy it,
Yeah.
but again, I'm not super into political stuff, and I don't really like hearing about, you know, the kind of this a little bit of, I don't want to say fear mongering, because actually he was actually pretty neutral when it comes to like future problems. He's kind of saying like, look, even if Florida, this is one example he gives, if Florida secedes from the US and becomes like a Latin American new country with Cuba, that doesn't necessarily change. The only thing that changes who owns the area. It's still Florida is still a critical piece of who can enter the Caribbean. So, you know, he's anyway. That's my take. If you really like geography, you'll like it. If you like geography and politics, you'll really like it. If you like just politics, maybe you'll like it too. But that's my take. Prisoners of Geography.
Okay.
It was good. I considered it double. But again, maybe I'm being a little harsh on there. So
that sounds, well, just like looking at the cover, and it's such a it is a really good title for a book. I mean, it makes you
he does have a follow-up to it, which I might check out. I can't remember the name of it, but that did interest me as well. So
yeah, I saw that. I was just looking at that on Amazon, The Power of Geography, and the Age of Walls. So it sounds like a pretty well researched
oh yeah, the guy's obviously really smart, and it's a really in-depth book, don't get me wrong. It's just a little bit too political stuff for my taste.
Yeah, that's interesting. All right, well, that's a good book. So
okay, let's hear what you got.
All right,
I'm excited.
Okay, this is a book. It's not political, but it has a lot of political implications. So the book is called The Fourth Turning. All right. And have you read this book?
I've not read it, but I've heard about it, probably from you.
Probably. This book, I think I've recommended to more people today than any other book to read.
Literally today?
Literally today. Yes. Just in the last couple years. So living in the United States and really anywhere in the world post-pandemic, politics are kind of crazy, and there's so much, it seems like, erupting every day. And what I loved about this book is it puts everything into perspective about how we get to these points in time. So these two economists, and this, by the way, was written in the 1990s, okay, William Strauss and Neil Howe. Now, Neil Howe just came out with a follow-up book a few months ago called The Fourth Turning is Here. But I wanted to start with The Fourth Turning. I may do a follow-up on The Fourth Turning is Here because I just read that a couple months ago. Like as soon as it came out, I ordered it. But I thought I'd start with this one because this was written in the mid-90s. And what these two economists did is they went back through different generations, different civilizations, and they found a recurring theme. And it makes a lot of sense that every 20 years we have a new generation. Like you've got a couple kids and you're a child of parents that were born. Maybe your parents are boomers. I don't know. What year were you born?
Do we really want to reveal that? I was born in '74, so my parents,
Roughish. Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
All right. Okay. All right. So you're like second wave Gen X. Okay.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
And your parents were born like between
50, 45, and 50, basically.
Okay. So they're like first wave boomers, like 1946 to 1964.
Yep.
So every 20 years, you've got a new generation, and that generation is raised by parents that were influenced in a certain way. And over time, these generations keep recurring. They keep the archetypes of each generation keep recurring. So I'm going to kind of spell some of this out, and it goes into a lot of great depth. I highly recommend reading the book. But he breaks time, these what he calls a saeculum, into 80 to 100 year periods. So that's a saeculum is like one cycle. All right. And each saeculum starts with a first turning, which he says is a high, an upbeat era of strengthening institutions and weakening individualism when new civic order implants the old values regime decays. All right, so that's the first turning. So, and that's about a 20 to 25 year period. And that's usually followed by the second turning, which is called an awakening, which is a passionate era of spiritual upheaval when the civic order comes under attack from a new values regime. So think of like the 1960s, 1970s, free love, rebellion against the institutions. That's what they call an awakening, at least for our current saeculum that we're in. The awakening is then followed by what's called an unraveling. It's a downcast era of strengthening individualism and weakening institutions when the old civic order decays and new values regime implants. That unraveling is then followed by what's called the fourth turning, which is a crisis, a decisive era of secular upheaval when the values regime propels the replacement of old civic order with a new one. So each saeculum is concluded with a crisis. All right. So as I'm reading this book, first time I read it, I'm like, okay, well, that's kind of an interesting idea to think about. But then it starts going into the different periods. So you think about prior crises that we've had in the United States. The Revolutionary War, 80 years later, was followed by the Civil War. 80 years later, followed by World War II. 80 years later is right now, thinking from mid 1940s to 2020s, we're about 80 years later. So in the 1990s, they were writing about sometime between 2005 to 2020, we'll start the next crisis. And it can be started with a financial crisis. It can be a pandemic. It can be terrorist attack. I mean, they're like listing these things back in the 90s. And as I'm reading this book in 2020, I'm thinking, check, like checking all the boxes. And again, it's not a political book. It doesn't have like Republican or Democrat. It doesn't get into any of that, but more focuses on this is the time that we're in. This is the end of this particular saeculum, which ends in a crisis. Now, each of these periods have archetypes. Okay, so you've got I'll start with the children that are born during the high. So in the first turning, you have what he calls the prophet generation. These would be your baby boomer children. So the 1946 to 1964, post World War II, is the first turning in our current saeculum. Does that make sense? So that's the high. You think about the soldiers that just went to war, the greatest generation. We call them that because they sacrificed so much during World War II. Well, they came home, and after that, it was like institutions were built. There was very good order. They had lots of children, the baby boomers. And so the baby boomers are the archetype is called a prophet. So they're the ones that start over time as they become or turn into their 20s through their 40s. They're kind of like the rebellious spirit. They bring on the awakening. The prophets, their children, our generation, the Gen Xers, are called the nomads. These are the latchkey kids that didn't grow up with a lot of supervision. Mom and dad aren't as concerned when you get home from wherever you are on the weekends. You show up at 1 or 2 in the morning. No one's like really checking in. I don't know about you, but
No,
kind
I got
it. Okay.
Yeah.
So those are the nomads. Now the nomads, having grown up with very little supervision, they are very experienced. They know what kind of things can go wrong after midnight. And so they're very protective of their kids. I mean, my kids, I know where they are. I mean, we're tracking them on Live 360. We know where all of our kids are. We know when they're going to get home. We know who they're hanging out with. We know pretty much what's going on in their lives. So they grew up in this very sheltered, protected world. And their generation, they are the hero generation. So we talk about like kids, like, they should get a trophy, a participation trophy. They're very sheltered, very protected. But these are the kids in this era, that's the millennials. So 1982, our Gen X is from 1965 to about 1982, and the millennials are 1983 to I think about 2006. So that's the generation that we would compare historically to the greatest generation. They're the ones that will be kind of the soldiers in this, next crisis. And then finally, after the crisis, the children that grow up during the crisis are the artist generation. They're the ones that will later go on to kind of perfect the institutions that their parents put in. So this cycle just keeps happening over and over and over again. And so as you think about like the awakening periods, usually the awakening and the crisis are about 40 years apart from each other. So I mean, it was crazy. As I was reading this book, I was like writing down a timeline, and I'm like, holy cow, this really does kind of plot out. So previous awakenings in the 1530s through the 1540s, you had the Protestant Reformation. And then 80 years later, kind of, you think like alternating time periods, the Puritan awakening from the 1630s to the 1640s, followed by the Pietist awakening from the 1740s to 1750s, the evangelical utopian awakening from the 1830s to the 1840s, and then you have the New Age awakening from the 1960s through the 1970s. So those are the awakening periods. Okay. Any questions so far?
I guess I'm the one thing I misunderstanding is so the kids are growing up now. So the hero generation. Then you said the artists, but wouldn't that be the new prophets?
Not yet. So
Okay.
the hero generation, their kids are the
The
artists.
artists. So
Uh-huh.
so who becomes the new heroes then?
The
Their
new
kids?
so the heroes are the children of the nomads.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
That's the
So
okay.
in the next saculum, so you have the prophet.
So you're telling me that millennials are going to be our heroes? That's a
Yes.
controversial statement right there.
Yes, that's exactly the claim that they make. And
Okay.
and the prophet generation, so the millennials' grandparents in the crisis, they're the generals. They're the ones that will lead the war. And it can be a civil
Okay.
war, it can be like a world war. It's usually a very big conflict. It's
Well,
not something small.
could it be an ideological war, technological war? I mean, because we got
Yeah,
other
yeah, it could
issues.
be. Yeah, I mean, um, it could be a cultural war, but historically they have been like physical
Hmm.
combat. So in the digital age, I don't know how does that play out. I mean, it could be very different. But the authors do talk about how each crisis is very decisive. There
Hmm.
is finality, there is an outcome. It's not left, well, did we win? Did we not win? There is a final victor in the war.
Hmm.
I mean, just think about the Revolutionary War. There was a victor there. The
Sure.
Civil War, there was a victor there. World War II, there was a victor. So you're hoping that as these crises happen, that there's a good outcome. And if it's managed well after the outcome, then we go on to like build the next wave of whatever it is over the next 100 years that we're building. But it's interesting, as I was reading this, just thinking about my own childhood, thinking, okay, well, I'm a nomad. And it just felt very comfortable reading. I was like, that fits kind of my life and my peers' lives. And it made
For sure.
just made a lot of sense. So it's a cycle that keeps repeating. And again, the book is called The Fourth Turning. The one thing that is interesting towards the end of the book, because I'm like, okay, well, if it's true, if we're in some kind of like crisis, and I'm not like saying that we are, I just thought it was a really interesting theory. Reading this book, I thought, okay, well, what are the things that I need to focus on? And they talk about just being a pillar of consistency in your circles of influence. So in your neighborhood, be somebody that people can count on. If you say something, do it, follow it up, just be kind of an anchor, because in these crisis periods, they can kind of unravel and happen very fast, and people are just not sure who to turn to. And it also feels very like the times that we live in today. We think, oh, it's never been this bad. And the reality is we've just never lived in a time like this. But times like this have existed over and over and over again. And they make several arguments throughout the book. Again, just citing history. They're not giving any kind of opinion. They're just saying you have to go back and look at history and read those times.
Right.
And okay, one last thought as I kind of wrap up on this book is that was also interesting is during the crisis, there is usually some kind of gray champion, what they call a gray champion, that emerges during the crisis and becomes somebody that kind of leads the victor. Like think of George Washington, or think of Ben Franklin, or FDR during the Great Depression. He was 3 terms as a president, which
Or Lincoln, right?
Lincoln, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So there's some kind of great champion. So as I was reading this book, I was just kind of, my mind was like wandering, like it would be interesting to see some kind of great champion in our time that everyone coalesces around to kind of lead through whatever it is we're going through. So but it gave me a lot of hope just to know, like, okay, we've been through some crazy times before. Super fascinating book. And if you want just a good historical read, if you like figures from history, again, it's not a political book, but it just goes back and cites these different cycles that we've been through. So
Okay, so batting practice, what are you going to apply from that book to your life?
for me, it is not leaning into too much into the media, not getting too worked up about politics and everything that's going on. It is interesting to follow some of the stories or to kind of point fingers at people, but I think for me, it's helped me just to focus more inwardly and focus on the things I can control: my family, where I work, the people I interact with, just to be that anchor in society. I think that's what I took away from it, because at the end of the day, you can't individually maybe control that outcome unless you're the great champion, Matt, which you might be. You're
This
on my
podcast
short.
is what it is. Yeah, for sure. No
You're on
question.
the short list. Although usually the great champion is a prophet archetype, so it's somebody that was in the awakening. They're the general.
I'm a nomad for sure. So
Well,
I
George Washington was a nomad, and
okay.
some argue that he was. So it doesn't have to be a prophet archetype; it can be a nomad.
Right.
But
His dad wasn't home when he came down to chop the cherry tree down. So that's why he was a latchkey kid, right?
he was a latchkey kid. That's right. You got it. Not a ton of supervision happening at his house. It is so fascinating though to read about, because they do get into some of these people's origin stories, like when they were younger, what they grew up with, kind of having to fend for yourself. And anyway, I think it's a book a lot of people can relate to, whether you're a millennial, whether you're an Xer, a boomer, or, for those that are the greatest generation, they'll probably read this and be like, yeah, we're about out of here, so we don't really care. It's up to you guys to kind of manage the next of whatever's to come. But anyways, great book. I recommend it more so people can just relax a little bit and recognize that we've been here. I mean,
Good.
humans have been here. We haven't been here, but it's not new to this earth.
Interesting.
By any means, and it'll keep repeating over and
So
over and over.
home run, double, single. What are you giving it?
Oh, this one's grand slam.
Grand slam. Okay.
Grand slam. Yep. I've got to give it a grand slam. And the follow-up book, The Fourth Turning Is Here. I would probably give it a home run as well.
Hold on.
Okay.
Maybe you're going to talk about it, right? We don't want to, not have someone skip. We don't want anyone to skip the next podcast that you talk about that book, right? They wouldn't want to cheat them out of that amazing opportunity. So
well, it's great. And if I ever get a chance to meet Neil Howe or to talk to him, I've got so many questions, because just that concept or the idea, how they thought to write about this, but to be so accurate in just calling out these things happen historically, and they'll probably happen again, and time will just keep ticking.
Two things to think about when you tell us about the next book, right? A couple questions I wrote down. How will technology, so does he address how technology is going to change the cycle or might, or the fact that humans live longer now, will that affect the cycle as well? Maybe they talk about the old book, but I'm for sure curious about the new one. If we talk about that. So just maybe something to think about it as when you get ready to tell us about that one.
Well, in this book, he does talk about the cycles a little bit, in that he's not too dogmatic that it's exactly 80 years. They recognize that sometimes the cycles can be 100 years or 80 years, but somewhere in that range. And you're absolutely right. Like, you look at the current leadership class, I would say, in the United States, that are older. They are still part of the silent generation, not necessarily the baby boomer generation. And usually it's the boomers that lead in that crisis. So he does leave some room that it's not a perfect match, but it's pretty consistent. Yeah.
I'm just thinking, we tend, at least in the US and many places around the world now, live longer than, the 1300s when you were an old man at 15. So just curious.
And think about, I don't know if you've ever done this, but if you take two clocks, that have not digital clocks, but ones that tick with a minute hand and a second hand.
Yeah.
If you put those clocks close together, and let's say that the seconds are off by 30 seconds, one's on the 12 and one's on the 6, over time, those clocks will start to tick together. The vibrations in the clocks, they'll get to where their second hand starts to tick together. And so he does talk about nations, as we are kind of interconnected with trade and with currencies with other countries, that over time, these nations kind of start to tick together in terms of their own saculums, so we're having other countries that are now kind of moving on the same timeline, which is interesting to think about, versus being a prisoner of geography, where if you're living in Antarctica and somebody's living in New Guinea, their clocks are very different. The timings are going to be off. So kind of interesting. But
all right, let's do our walk-up music. Today, I decided not to talk about music. I'm going to tell you about a film that I watched. Now, this is not a movie. This is definitely a film.
Oh boy, that is one of the most arrogant things.
I know.
The film I watched.
Wait till you watch it, because it's from a filmmaker called. I'm going to mess this up. Filmmaker Victor Kosavsky, something like that.
You nailed it.
There you go. It's called Aquarella, and it is. I can't remember where I watched it. Where did I watch it? I think I watched it on Stars or something. I think I got a subscription to Stars randomly. It looked interesting, and I didn't know what it was. It just talks about So are you Googling this right now?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So I don't know if I can fully recommend it unless you're really, really into water or ice. And it's very beautifully shot.
Okay.
And it starts out, and I'm gonna just spoil this because I doubt a lot of people are gonna watch this. I'm watching it, and it just shows ice, and you hear this crazy cracking of the ice, and it's very disturbing if it's on really loud. And then all of a sudden you just see these people on what's clearly like a lake or ocean or something of ice, and they're walking around, and they get down and they look like they're looking. At first I thought they were like trying to listen to the ice. No, they're looking in the ice. They're like trying to like see into the ice. Finally, all of a sudden they're like, oh, come over here, and they see whatever they're looking for. Then they start like breaking the ice, and they build these almost like drills. They put something in the ice, and then they put a giant log with a rope around it, and they just kind of start walking around to pull this rope up that they've got attached. And they're pulling something up out of the ice. Suddenly you see that they're pulling a car out of the ice, and they're pulling this car out of the ice, and you're like, what is going on? And there's this whole movie, there's no real talking. Eventually they do have some subtitles. One of the guys says, looks like everything's fine, just the front end is messed up. Like they're gonna go and try to fix this car up. And they said, and then all of a sudden one guy says to the other, hey, how did you get out? And he's like, oh, we broke through the back window. And I'm like, and in my mind I'm like, what is going on here?
Okay.
These guys fell through the ice in this car and then broke out the back window, then went back and retrieved this vehicle that is under the ice. And I'm like, what is going on in this movie? And then all of a sudden you see cars just going on this ice, right? Moving along. All of a sudden, boom, they just crash. They like the front end goes down a little bit. They basically crash into the sheet of ice, and then they start sinking. Okay. And then so it goes from like you just seeing this ice, hearing this ice, then looking, finding a car. Suddenly you watch these different cars going across, and you can hear the concern in the people that are filming. You can hear their voices like, oh man, they should not be driving right now. And then all of a sudden, boom, you just see this thing crash. And it's not like it just goes into the ice. It's doing 50, 60 miles an hour. All of a sudden smashes into the ice and then starts to sink. And then all of a sudden there's just this giant truck, and it must distribute the weight differently with these giant tires. It's going over basically a rescue vehicle to try and save these people from drowning in this ice cold water. So they go over there, and these two guys pop out of where the car had just gone under the ice, and this one guy's like, everywhere he steps, he starts falling back into the ice. Like the ice keeps cracking that area, and he falls back in. And then all of a sudden, you can tell they're looking for somebody. They're trying to get somebody else out, and they can't find him. This guy is freezing. He's panicking. He's all bloody from this accident. And his buddy, they're trying to find this other person on the ice. So then suddenly it shows them digging. Like suddenly they see where the other guy is, and they try to get him out. It's crazy. Apparently, I believe that part was filmed in Greenland because I looked it up. But it's basically this area that like just basically says like, they obviously use it as some sort of highway, but certain times of the year clearly not a good idea.
Okay.
So anyway, that's how it starts. So super weird. I was kind of intrigued, but then all of a sudden it just started showing like waves, like ocean waves in slow motion. And I'm like, okay, this is a bit boring. I'm not a surfer. I'm going to fast forward this. And so it was weird. I mean, it was kind of cool, weird show. But I'm just basically telling you, so you don't have to watch it. The only interesting part was watching the cars, the beginning, the cars falling into the ice, and them rescuing these cars, like they're going to rebuild them, and then these people, like foolishly going on this ice and then crashing, and unfortunately, the guy one of his buddies dies because they drove on this ice.
And this is like a documentary.
Yeah, but there's no talking. There's no. I mean, like I said, those guys occasionally say things that gets translated into the captions.
Okay.
But they don't explain what's going on. You basically just have to wait till you see this. Like you have when they're looking into the ice, you're like, what is going on? And then suddenly they start cranking these homemade cranes, for lack of a better word, and they are pulling out a car. Your mind is like, what is going on here? Who would drive on here? And then they literally show a bunch of people driving. Some of them don't crash. Some of them do. It's crazy. Anyway,
they're driving into the Bermuda Triangle. They're just like testing fate to see what happens with their car.
Yeah, it is. It's crazy. I was shocked at how violent the crash was, because again, just imagine you're going along and all of a sudden like the front part just sinks, but it's so quick. It's not like you just sink slowly.
Yeah.
You crash into the sheet of ice and then you start to sink. It's crazy.
People
Anyway,
are nuts.
I anyway, so that's my non-recommendation for the week. So all
I
right,
love I love movies like that. I'll just stare and watch a
just
movie with
watch
yeah.
yeah, just you could just watch it for the first like 20 minutes and that's all you need to see.
All right.
After
Sounds
that,
good.
it's like you have to be a surfer to truly appreciate these cool waves, you know. So anyway,
Okay. Aquarella.
yep.
All right, I'll check it out. All right, so my quote for this week is this is from a book called The Screw Tape Letters. It's written by great author C.S. Lewis,
Mhm.
and I read it again this week. I thought this is really applicable to our time as I was thinking about the fourth turning, like the takeaway. But in the book, you've got Screw Tape, who's like one of the devil's helpers, and he's writing to his nephew Wormwood, and Wormwood is like a tempter. He's trying to get this guy to turn away from values, turn away from Christianity, and so in these Screw Tape letters, he writes this letter to Wormwood. And I read this book several years ago, but this one quote just came back to the surface for me this week. He says this. He says, "Be sure that the patient, that's the person that Wormwood is tempting, remains completely fixated on politics, arguments, political gossip, and obsessing on the faults of people they have never met serves as an excellent distraction from advancing in personal virtue, character, and things that the patient can control. Make sure to keep the patient in a constant state of angst, frustration, and general disdain toward the rest of the human race in order to avoid any kind of charity or inner peace from further developing. Ensure the patient continues to believe that the problem is, quote, out there in the, quote, broken system, rather than recognizing there is a problem within himself." So I just thought that was a masterful quote for our day. You know, there's a lot of broken things out there, but I think if we all just kind of looked inside and said, what can I work on personally to develop my family, to develop myself? What are the little things that I can do to serve and be of benefit to my fellow man? Just really resonated with me this week. So that's the quote. C.S. Lewis, just a
That's a great quote.
masterful.
I got a little nervous there when you said Screw Tape Letters, but it resonates for what you're talking about, which is more personal development, which is kind of what we talk about a little bit here. Not necessarily any sort of religious thing. It's read that very first part again. Make sure to the patient focuses on what?
Yeah, be sure the patient remains completely fixated on politics, arguments, political gossip, and obsessing on the faults of people they have never met serves as an excellent distraction from advancing in personal virtue, character, and the things that the patient can control. And
Yeah,
again,
that's great.
to your point, you know, I think this quote applies outside of Christianity, whatever
Exactly.
faith
That's what I
or
was saying. Is it
yeah,
doesn't
yeah,
really matter what you believe, other than if you're not focused on being a good person yourself and what you can control, and if
yes,
all it is all the problems those fat cats in Washington, you know what I mean? Then you're not really making a
that's
difference
right.
in your own life. That's a great quote. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Anyway, so hope you like that.
I
All right.
love it.
Thanks, Matt.
All right. Hey, everybody, remember to like and subscribe to the podcast. And if you have any email suggestions that you want to send to us, it is pitchbookpodcast@gmail.com. Send us an email. Tell us how great we are or how terrible we are. We don't really care. Just let us know. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.
See you.